It's what?
It's often misspoken.
Perfect. So I'm Joseph Kopser, and welcome back to another live episode of Catalyst Talks. I'm joined today by Shannon Huffman Polson, who I heard speak as keynote at Bunker Labs almost 2 weeks ago. She was phenomenal. I literally reached out immediately on LinkedIn and said, come please, and share 30 minutes talking about the grit factor. So Shannon, how are you and how is everything today?
I am doing great, and it's so wonderful to be with you and your audience.
Well, we're thrilled to have you. So the way this works for people that are watching, this is live right now on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Drop any questions that you might have, any comments based on anything that Shannon or I say. And for the next 30 minutes, we're going to go rapid fire through a lot of questions. So just this morning, in email, I subscribed to a service called Unbelievably by Bill Murphy Jr., and the title was Grit. We did not plan it in advance, and the fact that he was talking about grit this morning, I knew this was going to be a great discussion. So tell the audience, what is grit and why is it important?
Yeah, fantastic. And I love that synergy. It's always fun when those things come together. I have defined grit as a dogged determination in the face of difficult circumstances. And many of you may know the excellent work from Angela Duckworth at University of Pennsylvania as well. She talks about it as passion and perseverance towards a very long-term goal. But I really have relied on my own definition from my own experience, because it really, in this past year especially, those long-term goals, those long-term horizons can be really hard to see, really difficult to define. And so that doggedness.
For our viewers that maybe haven't looked down in the bio to see your description, I mean, your life in the military really influenced this work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that was one of the things that really helped me to get going in the direction that ultimately became the grit factor, was understanding from my own experience. A number of years ago, I had the opportunity to be one of the first women to fly the Apache helicopter in the United States Army. Awesome. I went on to lead 3 line units on 3 different continents. And then I ended up transitioning through my MBA at the Tech School at Dartmouth, and then had the chance to lead outstanding teams in the corporate world as well, especially at Microsoft, a company you might have heard about. And so it really is interesting. What is that one element that was so critical to success at all of the most challenging times? And that started from my own experience. But as you know, the grit factor brings in experiences and stories and lessons learned from a number of different leaders in the vanguard of their fields.
And so when you talk about stories, we were talking in the green room that for 100,000 years, that's how we passed information. Why is storytelling such an important skill to know? And why did you use that as the focus in your book?
Yeah, and I approach all of the research in the grit factor, and it's all supported by the secondary research into leadership and management and psychology, but I approach all of it through story. And they're the stories that were so generously shared by the leaders that form the basis and the spine of the grit factor. They all happen to be women. They all happen to be military. They're aviators across 3 generations, a Navy submariner, a combat rescue swimmer in the Coast Guard, one of the first women Army Rangers. So this incredible cohort of leaders shared their stories so generously and their lessons learned to form that backbone. And I wanted to approach it through story because, as you know, the neuroscience is very, very clear that our brains take in information in the form of story. We truly internalize things through story. So in order to approach the depth of that research, we've got to approach it through the stories and the lived experiences of others in order to really and truly understand it in the deepest and most impactful way.
And the reason why I like that approach, I'm biased. I have to admit, I've got a tagline that I've been using for 20 plus years, which I share with everyone, which is people will be what they can see. And so the value I see in your storytelling is that people, even if they're not old enough yet, or maybe they're not in that field, when they hear the stories of leadership, courage, and resilience, which I think are some of the words in your subtitle, that they can see themselves in that. So how does that play out in your book?
Yeah, I think that's such an important thing. And I'm so glad to know that you've recognized that as well. Well, and maybe I'll go back to the genesis of the grit factor, just in honor of storytelling, which was a young lieutenant reaching out to me a number of years ago and asked me to be her mentor as she began the same journey as an aviation leader at Fort Rucker, Alabama. And I immediately said yes, but then I second guessed myself because it had been a number of years since I had served in uniform. It had been a number of years since I had this experience as one of the first women to fly the Apache. So this integration that was somewhat unique. And I wondered, how can I scale the advice that I offer to her? And if I do that work, then scale the people to whom that advice is available. And then I began this process of interviewing these leaders, and I would find leaders through other leaders, and again, came up with this phenomenal cohort, really willing to share their stories in a meaningful way. And they come from all different backgrounds. So I think that's the helpful thing from what you just shared, is that you can see yourself in stories when you understand they're not all, super hardcore athletes before they ever joined the military. Karen Brash defined herself as a Texas sorority girl before she joined the Navy and went to OCS and ultimately became a Navy commander. And others like Shay Haber, one of the first women Army Rangers, she was a semi-professional triathlete and weightlifter. So their backgrounds are wildly diverse, which allows us to really identify or put ourselves in that place in some meaningful way.
Well, there's so many places to go with this conversation. I want to pick up a thread you brought up about the genesis, or the way I would interpret that is how you as an entrepreneur saw a problem and then realized, wait, I can fix this if I can scale it. And the question was, would you be a mentor to that young person you were talking about? So I like to throw out an opportunity for people to learn more about Janice Omedeke. In fact, maybe she'll be in the second volume of your book. She's an entrepreneur that started a company called The Mentor Method. And one of the things that frustrated her in her Genesis story is that as a young Black woman working in a professional firm, reaching out for mentorship, they immediately linked her up with people who identified or looked like her. And to use her words, because that's how the company saw her or her potential, to which her point was, no. My potential is about leadership, or to use your words, leadership, courage, and resilience. That's not limited by gender, and that's not limited at all by ethnicity or race. So how does that factor in? We talked about this idea of it's focused on your experience as a male-dominated environment, but I think the lessons are universal, aren't they?
Absolutely, Joseph. And I think one of the things I'd love to, maybe this can help to put it into some context, is as I synthesized the stories and the lessons learned from these incredible leaders, it really broke out into 3 sections. And this is what I now call the grit triad, right? There's commit, there's learn, and there's launch. Now, commit is this deep internal work of really owning and shaping your past to be the foundation of your grit. And we can get into that more, or I hope all of your viewers will get into
in the military. We were taught very early, which is to know thyself and seek self-improvement. In other words, to know what your strengths and weaknesses are. So that's spot on. Keep going. So that's the commitment layer.
That's the commitment phase, right? And then the learn phase is this deep engagement in the present. And I'd like to come back to that because that addresses your question. But that's building your team, which includes the mentors, and also doing the mindset work and the deep active listening development that allows you to be that team player, that allows you to lead, and that allows you to build that grit and resilience, which absolutely can be built and is innate to every single one of us. And the final piece is the launch piece. The launch piece is grounded in that past. It's deeply engaged in the present, and then it's looking to the future. And it's looking to the future specifically with audacity, with authenticity, and with adaptability. But to come back, so that's the framework of the grit triad, right?
Yeah, which I love, by the way.
Isn't it awesome? Yeah, frameworks are good. They help to ground us, really, to root us. And coming back to that mentorship piece, which falls within that deep engagement in the present, I'm so glad that you brought up that particular element, because it's absolutely true. And this came out from multiple interviews, that if you're going to assign mentors, if you're going to develop a mentorship program, you need to be sure that it's not just about pairing like people with like people based on gender or race or any other sort of a characteristic. And in fact, while that may be an important relationship for them to develop, it's actually just as and possibly more critical for that mentor to be in that majority group that has power, right? And so if you're helping to bring somebody up in an organization that is still primarily white male, which is frankly most of them, they should also have probably a white male mentor that can help them to negotiate within the confines and within the construct of that organization.
Yeah. I had the opportunity 20 years ago in grad school to take a class on power and gender from the first woman prime minister of Canada, Kim Campbell. And she referred to this based on the literature in leadership, this 20 to 30% rule. And I'd be curious to your thoughts about anybody who falls under that amount, whether a small percentage of women or small percentage of minorities, or whatever the category is, that until they break above that 20 or 30% threshold, they're always seen as the other, or seen as the token, or the representative, or the minority. What is the value of that, as you say, person that comes out of the majority to bring back? What are some examples that you've seen and written about in the Grit Factor that you think will be valuable to our viewers today?
Yeah, one of the best examples that I had a chance to interview both parties, and actually then a third party as well, was looking at Major General Dawn Dunlop. And she's a test pilot and everything in the Air Force inventory, just a phenomenal human being. I had a chance to talk with her several times and actually meet her in Washington, D.C. before COVID hit. And she had a mentor in Marsh Carter when she was part of the White House Fellows Program. And Marsh Carter was a 2-time Purple Heart recipient in Vietnam. He's now at MIT Sloan. He was president of State Street Bank. And he's mentored a number of both military and non-military people, both on Wall Street and in uniform. And what they found is that for them, it was really important for them to have a shared connection. And they had this shared love of aviation. And that was more important than when she was assigned a mentor who happened to be a woman and they had nothing in common. That relationship had nothing really to take hold. But the relationship and the mentorship relationship with Marsh Carter, which she continued for many, many years, was one that was grounded on some shared interests and some chemistry. And it's a relationship like anything else, right? It's a reciprocal relationship. And so understanding the nuances of that through that example, I thought was particularly excellent. And I know, again, your viewers will enjoy that in the Grit Factor with some more detail to that.
Well, I love your term reciprocal. And I think that's such an important part about mentorship or any relationship that's learning and growing on that learning portion of your triad, is this notion of it's got to be a two-way street. That's what I write about in my own guide to mentorship that's on my website. Yeah. If it's not two-way, then somebody is using the other person, and that's not sustainable. And and proteges or mentees, however you want to refer to them, often ask, well, what is the appropriate level of give back? What is that two-way street? And my point is, it can be just as simple as a quick email that says, I got that promotion, or a simple note that said, our daughter was born. It doesn't have to be much. It just needs to be a gesture that I remember, I appreciate, and I want to stay in touch. What other advice do you have to build that reciprocal relationship?
Well, I think it's really important for both sides to understand in a mentorship relationship that even if you're the senior person in that relationship, there's a great deal that you have to learn from that junior person as well, from their perspective on the world, from how they relate both as a potential employee might or as a potential customer might. And so that's really where you want both sides to be learning from each other, asking each other questions, coming to each other with, hey, how would you see that? How would you interpret that? And I think that mutual respect and understanding that reciprocity is about mutual respect and the understanding that you can learn from every single person is a really critical component. I mean, it is critical to any relationship. And so it's helpful to remember that mentorship is another relationship. And that needs to be part of that in that give and take and that interchange and mutual respect.
Yeah, well said. So we've got about 15 minutes left. So I want to turn on two topics that were kind of inspired by what I took away from your presentation, but also speaks to what you mentioned earlier in the launch portion of your triangle when you're talking about looking to the future and building that bench. So I have seen it firsthand. I was working with 20-year-olds when I was 20. When I was in company command at 25, still working with 20-year-olds. Every job I've ever had to, including when I ran for Congress or built my startup, it was 20-somethings that helped me build it because that's where they were in life and their journey. So I'm a big fan of what you can accomplish in your 20s. But as people get older, they become, for some reason, forgetful that they too had struggles in their 20s. They too needed help, and they just dismiss younger generations. What did you see in your work or in your book that you think kind of speaks to the idea of how you build that future bench that you're talking about in that third triangle?
Well, it's an interesting approach, and I've never had that question phrased in quite that way. So I really appreciate that. One of the things I realized as I was doing the work for the Grit Factor is I had a lot of incredible insight from some very senior officers, and again, general officers across the services, right? And a number of field grade officers that had done that full career. And I realized at some point, I was like, I really need to get back into some of the tactical applications of leadership at the lower levels, because that's where you're really directly involved with the people that are doing the work, right? And the senior officers that do it well find a way to connect, find a way to remind themselves, and that's critical as well. That leadership has to evolve, obviously, as you
leadership through presence. They physically get there, or they literally connect.
Absolutely. But one of the things that was really, really both a joy and really quite interesting was the chance to reach out then and talk to Shay Haver, one of the first women Army Rangers who started out as an Apache pilot. She's now in her second infantry company command. She and Kristen Greist, her good friend who went through Ranger School with her, they're both now infantry commanders. And
That's
she is
so awesome.
a phenomenal human being. So talking to her, there's another woman who was in essentially the Army equivalent of the Lioness program that did the work out with the Afghan women. And so talking to these people that were operating in the junior officer capacity, in the company grade officer capacity, so this is all in your 20s, right? Really let us get into the meat of what it means to work with people in the tactical way, in the tactical sense of really getting out there and getting your boots muddy. I like to call it muddy boots leadership, right? Which is getting out there with the people doing the work. And that's a very different.
And it's direct. It's the direct form of leadership. It's not indirect. You are there facing the people you work with when you make a dumb decision, when you make a bad decision. I mean, you have to stand there for accountability.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. And, there is some relationship to the management by walking around piece for sure. That's the more of the corporate terminology, but the muddy boots leadership, I love it because we always said that a soldier never trusts somebody whose boots are too shiny. That means you haven't been out of your office, right? You haven't been out getting your boots dirty. And so that discussion with the company grade officers, with the people in their 20s, or the people that are out there with those muddy boots and doing that stuff that they need to get done. And so, that added a very important component to the grit factor that, again, we can all learn from the senior leaders as well as the junior leaders. And that's where we really want to make this a much more holistic perspective of what leadership looks like, what grit looks like in that whole leader concept.
Yeah. And I want to remind folks, we're live right now across Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. If you have any questions or comments for Shannon, please, by all means, drop them in the chat. But I want to go back to this point. In fact, this is a little off topic, but you brought it up and it is so key. This idea of muddy boots and actually being there, not just walking through, being there. So when I was a chief of staff of an 1,100 person battalion, 27 Cav in Iraq, my job was focused on the headquarters, but I had to get out from time to time to stay relevant, number one. And number two, just because otherwise you'd lose all legitimacy if you hid behind the wire. And every time I went out, every single time I went out, I not only learned something, but I've learned something about the troubles and tribulations of those soldiers on the front line, whether it be the armament wasn't right, or one of my favorite examples, we had a Humvee that had no air conditioner, and the shop NCO was telling them, parts on, order, it's just not here yet. And in Iraq, 110 degrees inside of a Humvee, all buttoned up, that gets hot. So when I heard the whole story and then tracked it all down and got all the answers, then I went back to the supply sergeant and said, well, okay, I believe you, but you're going to be riding in that vehicle until that vehicle is fixed. Shannon, magically, the next day, that vehicle was fixed, the part arrived, and everything went normal. So being there, muddy boots, is important. Well, so we literally only have, we have got less than 10 minutes, and I've got too many more topics to cover. But let's get into this notion for just a second about how you scale this and what your goals are for the Grit Factor. And I believe it's called the Grit Institute. Do I have that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, again, after doing this work, and this has been 5 years of research and bringing in these stories and these lessons learned, it's an honor to have the Grit Factor out into the world. So one goal is to get the Grit Factor into as many hands as possible. But at the Grit Institute, I've been doing this for now 7 years, but I keynote to large audiences, large corporations, and really bring those primary messages home to whatever is most relevant to the challenges of that corporation. But the second part of it is really designing tailored leadership facilitation opportunities for those companies and organizations. Because at the end of the day, the book is important, the keynote is important, and then we really want to integrate it into company culture. I mean, we all know that culture is ultimately the driver, right, of what makes things work and and as we look at this future of work, this COVID and then post-COVID world, really bringing these lessons home in a meaningful way so that it becomes part of your company culture is just really, really exciting. So I'm thrilled to have a chance to start and to continue that work with companies now and look forward to finding more people who are excited about that transformation in their own company culture.
Well, you brought it up. Let's go in that direction. I too am fascinated with the future of work and what it means versus, the traditional classroom style that we developed, frankly, 150 years ago in agrarian society to a more learning or experimental learning environment. And of course, like you say, culture has so much to do with it. So what does the future of work look like, whether it be people that work at their desk or people that work away from a desk? What does it look like to you?
I think the most important thing to take away when we consider the future of work is that there's one thing that is going to remain constant, and we creatively need to find a way to address this, no matter what the future of work might ultimately end up being shaped as. And that most important thing comes back actually to money-rich leadership. Because at the end of the day, and my first battalion commander said this when he pinned on the silver bars of the first lieutenant, right? Kind of that advanced driver's permit. He said, the only good use of any increased power is the increased responsibility to take care of your people. And so the future of work is about what work is now, and that is about people. Now, how you take care of your people is the question to solve in the future of work. Whether we're hybrid, remote, whether we're hybrid, whether we're back in an office in a different sort of a way, it's about connecting with and taking care of your people. And as you know, you take care of your people and your people take care of the mission. The future of work is people.
Yeah, well said. That brings up 2 points I want to drive home, which is when I left the military, that environment, that culture, and got into the startup world, the success that we achieved as a company was 100% the team that built it. And I had several team members that had no military experience. And because my co-founder was military, our COO was military. I mean, there were a lot of former military. And both the men and women both said, this company culture is different. Now, what we did, to your point, is I think we focused on people, because if our people had what they needed, they were more successful. And the second point that you brought up, I think is worth driving home, which is in Catalyst, and this is like Catalyst Talk episode number 60, 70, I don't know, I long since have forgotten what count we're up to, but in episode 2 or 3, it was a conversation about the fact that now managers and leaders had to do more than the lip service of asking their employees how they're doing. They had to really mean it. And like you said earlier, actively listen to what was being said, or else their teammates became, ineffectual very quickly. So what have you seen in COVID that you think are some of the things we absolutely need to keep doing going forward?
Yeah, well, it's really been fun, actually, again, talking to companies, looking at different examples of what works well and what doesn't work well. One of the things, a couple of the examples that I've heard that I just absolutely love, one of them was actually another speaker's son, who's an adult, is working at American Express. And he was ill for some time, not with COVID, but with something else. And American Express sent him chocolate chip cookies at home, because you can't do anything else, right? But you've got to make people feel connected and in a meaningful way. There's another startup, which is a super cool company. And as soon as they went remote, they're venture funded, so they had the funds to do this, but they started to send fresh flowers to their employees every week. Again, something that you can do that is a meaningful touch that connects to people, that reminds them that you care about them. There's another company I've heard of, again, that there was a young woman who had a young employee that had a child. I think she was a single mom, and they set up a meal service for her as well. So those types of things are ways that you go above and beyond in a time of particular challenge, understanding the particular challenge that somebody might be going through and taking the extra time to really reach out and do something about that. I think that's incredibly meaningful. But perhaps even more meaningful is, on a broader sense, those companies who have realized that, statistically speaking, people are working, especially in the tech industry, as many as 3 hours more a day than they were before, right? Without commutes, without other things, without ever coming off of line. And so really taking care of your people as a leader means setting boundaries, not sending an email or scheduling a meeting before a certain time, let's say 9 a.m. and not after 5 p.m. You don't send an email then. You set the example yourself as the leader, and you hold your people to it to set those boundaries so that they can take care of themselves. Because once they're burned out, it's too late, right? And so you've got to really address that up front with the boundary setting and those personal connections.
I so agree with what you were saying, that years ago I had a boss, George Casey, who went around to every one of his leaders. And this is a guy who, for a period of time, several years, was running the war in Iraq. You talk about amazing responsibility and pressure. But every week he would take one day off, completely unplug. And out of that, he had an acronym that I kind of rearranged for my own purpose. And I wrote a blog about the importance of rest, which is reading, exercising, sleeping, and thinking every single day in order to allow you as a leader. Because if you're not, whether you call it leader care or self-care, if you're not there, if you physically, mentally are not there present because you're distracted or hurt in some other way, you can't be there for your team. And that's so critical. So we're literally out of time. We're landing this plane, landing this helicopter, whatever metaphor. I'm a ground cavalryman, so I don't mean to offend, but what do you want to leave the audience with? How can they get in touch with you? We've been dropping links in here. What do you want to leave us with?
Yeah, absolutely. No, an honor to be with you. I just remind everybody of the Grit Triad, commit, learn, and launch. I hope you'll pick up your copies of the Grit Factor, and that'll help to go much deeper into each of those areas. And you can find me at shannonpolson.com, thegritinstitute.com, also on LinkedIn and also on Twitter. So I'd love to see you in any of those places and look forward to how I can serve you and your organization.
Well, Shannon, it's been a thrill having you. I knew you would not disappoint after I saw your keynote last week. In fact, it was so good that I was like, wait, is that live or is that tape? Because she's not missing a beat. There hasn't been a stutter or an or an aw. And then I realized you were reading, Shannon, the comments. I'm like, that's live. That, and by the way, for viewers that maybe don't know how hard it was to transition to speaking in a virtual environment like that, you, madam, get an A+ for that, because that is hard to do. So I hope people check out your book, Grit Factor. I hope they check out your website, shannonpolson.com. And Joel, thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch up with everybody later on. Thanks a lot, Shannon.
Thank you.